This morning we're going to move on and begin a journey into what is widely considered the greatest sermon ever preached. This sermon was not preached by the likes of Billy Graham or Spurgeon or John Calvin or Martin Luther, St. Augustine or Peter or even Paul. This sermon was preached by Jesus Christ himself. It is commonly known as the Sermon on the Mount. This sermon begins with a section known as the Beatitudes, and that's what we'll focus on this morning. Now, I'm sure you've probably learned about the Beatitudes a long time ago, maybe in a Sunday school class or elsewhere, but it never hurts to have a refresher course. The word beatitude means blessing. So Jesus begins his sermon by describing the life of those individuals who God will bless. And before I get too far into it, let's go to the Gospel of Matthew now, chapter 5, and look at the words of Jesus. We'll be reading from verses 1 through 12 this morning. And if you're following in your pew Bible, you'll find it on page 683. And again, we'll be reading from Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 through 12. Now when he saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." May the Lord's blessing be added to the reading and hearing of his holy word. I remember being back in seminary, not that it was that long ago, but a specific incident I remember. One of my professors relayed to us a story when he was just a young pastor himself, and he said one time he told the congregation he was going to preach the greatest sermon ever preached. And those words are meant to sort of provoke some kind of interest in what he is saying, and it certainly got that response. One individual in his congregation was somewhat upset with him for being so arrogant as to saying that his sermon was the greatest ever preached. But what he meant to say was that he was preaching on the Sermon on the Mount, the greatest sermon ever preached. So I'm not going to say that I am preaching the greatest sermon ever preached, but I am preaching on that, just to make the distinction there. And this morning, the way that I attack this, I guess, is probably not the best word to use, is that I've done a couple of these messages before by giving what I consider a first-hand account of someone and try to get inside the text as someone who would have experienced it firsthand. Maybe someone who witnessed the Sermon on the Mount that day that it was preached by Jesus, to sort of drive home the importance of the sermon that Jesus preached so long ago and the effects it probably had on many individuals who witnessed it. So for the rest of this message, I will be speaking as an older man, not someone who was just a boy, a young boy at the time when Jesus was preaching that day. And this fictional man is looking back on his life and on that day in particular. So it goes like this. You know, my recollections are few from the days of my youth. I must say that for me, my earliest memory is without a doubt that day when I was among the massive crowd that had gathered. Now, before I get into all that, we all know that every generation has certain days they will never forget. But nothing can compare to the day when my family packed up to see this great healer who was traveling through the region. And that's not an exaggeration. Word spread quickly throughout the land that this Jewish man from Nazareth was teaching and healing people, casting out demons and doing those kinds of things. So you can imagine the excitement that it generated when he came to our region. Word has spread that his name was Jesus. And one day, I will never forget this, my family was by the Sea of Galilee, and there were people as far as the eye could see. It was the most beautiful day you could imagine, too. The sun was shining, there was a cool breeze coming off the lake, and more importantly, there was a sense of joy in the air. Even as a young boy, I wasn't always aware of such things, but I just felt different that day on the mountainside. Looking back, I can't even tell you why my family was there. I don't recall anyone in my family needing healing, but regardless of the reason, we were there, and we were in for a good message. I remember Jesus ascending the side of the mountain. He took a seated position, which meant that he was ready to teach. A hush went over the crowd at once. No one had to be told to quiet down. It was as if they just knew that something special was going to happen. Even my little infant brother, who always seemed to be crying, was even quiet when the teacher was talking. I remember thinking, I wish we'd come here more often. That way he would close his mouth a little more. But if you have a younger sibling, you probably know what I mean. Well, I was just playing in the dirt at the time, just making some drawings with a stick. I mean, this was back in 30 AD, so kids didn't have a lot of things to occupy their time like they do nowadays. So no one thought that I was really paying any attention at all to the great teacher, but I was. See, kids hear a lot more than they let on, and I was no different. All these years later, what I remember more than anything was that the teacher didn't have to strain his voice at all to be heard. You would think he would have had to project very loudly to be heard over the distance and over all those people, but he didn't have to do that. His voice was the softest, most peaceful sound, as if he were using his words to woo people to come to him. And when he talked, it was as if you were the only one there, and he was talking to me alone. As a kid, I admit I have lied to my parents in the past, saying that I couldn't hear them when they called for me to come in from outside when it was time for dinner. But that day, there was no denying the voice of Jesus Christ. Everyone heard him. To this day, I can still hear his words. He was talking about blessedness. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." As a kid, I didn't always understand everything that I heard, especially on that day, but I do remember being comforted by his words, whether I understood them or not. I didn't really understand what poor in spirit meant, but I do now. I know that all of us are poor in spirit, and it is Jesus Christ, when he comes into our life, that fills that void in our lives. Then he said, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." At the time, my mind went back about a year or so when my uncle died unexpectedly. And I remember my mother and father spending days crying, mourning his loss. All that I wanted was for them to be happy again. And I wondered if this man, if this Jesus, could bring comfort if we would lose another family member, God forbid. Then he said, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." I could tell that my mother and father were not especially happy with the way that they were governed, but they certainly couldn't do anything about that. We all knew that the governor was a very harsh man in the region, and it seems the only way that anyone could ever take control was by force. Yet here was this man, Jesus, promising that those who were meek those who are humble and submissive would be the ones to inherit the earth instead of the strong and the proud. Under normal circumstances, I would have expected my parents to just think this was some kind of crazy talk. I mean, can actually being submissive earn a person the power needed to rule? But I was surprised that during my parents' conversations on the way home, they bought into this. They believed him. I didn't realize until later how the words of Jesus gave them hope in a world that the world won't always be as terrible as it is now. See, my family was like your typical Jewish family. We were not rich by any means, and there were days when we had to cut back on eating, especially after the tax collector came to town. We knew what it was like to be hungry, and we knew what it was like to be thirsty. So Jesus' words really hit home for us, and I'm sure for others, when he said, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled." You see, it was the perfect mental image to explain this feeling of finally being satisfied. We all knew what it was like to hunger for food, but hungering for righteousness was the hook that really drew us in. And then Jesus said, "Blessed are the merciful, and blessed are the pure in heart, and blessed are the peacemakers." And each utterance brought to mind either a situation that our family experienced or a desire that we strongly held. It was as if this teacher had been spying on us for the last 5, 10, or more years. He seemed to know the exact words to say that would catch our attention and make us stop and think. How could he know this? You'd think he might have been something more than a man. Well, as I said earlier, this day is probably my earliest childhood memory, but it's a very good one. And it really wasn't until years later that I got a better understanding of who this man was who was teaching on the mountainside that day. For me, that was simply one step in a process. Let me explain that. First, I heard his teaching that day, and the word stuck with me. Then, about 3 years later, word spread through the same region that this same teacher that we saw teach that day was arrested and was put on trial. And the next day, we learned that he was killed by crucifixion. That's also a day that I will never forget. Again, I was only 3 years older than the day on the mountainside, so my parents wouldn't have allowed me anywhere near the angry crowds on that day. But it's still a day I will remember, because late in the afternoon, we felt this sudden earthquake shake the region, and the sky turned as black as midnight. From my perspective, even being a kid, it's very memorable, sort of like seeing a solar eclipse or seeing a comet go by in the night sky. But soon enough, life did go back to normal for us. I did have enough sense at the time to ponder in my mind why such a peaceful man would be treated that way. To me, it didn't make sense. And it's funny how these things still remain fresh in my memory, even though they took place so long ago. But on the day of the earthquake, the words of Jesus from the mountainside came back to me when he said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." And I remember thinking how Jesus seemed to be a peacemaker from everything that we had heard. So I guess he must be a son of God, whatever that means. Well, an odd thing was that arguments began breaking out among the Jewish rulers about whether or not Jesus was or was not the Son of God. And I wasn't always the sharpest tack in the drawer, as they say, but I did notice that most of the people who claimed that Jesus was the Son of God tended to fit a certain description that Jesus gave on the mountainside. What I mean is that people who clung to faith that this man was the Son of God, they were poor in spirit, meaning they lived mournful, humble lives and good lives. While on the other hand, Those who denied that he was who he said he was were the exact opposite. They tended to be arrogant and violent and rude and lived life without a care in the world. There were even men in the temple who fit that description. It was as if their hunger for power was somehow threatened by this peace-loving teacher from Nazareth. That didn't make sense to me either. These were the people who were not compassionate at all towards Jesus. Sometimes they even said that he deserved this crucifixion, but when they were pressed for details as to why that's the case, they always came up short of an answer. As I grew up, I started to pay more attention to what was going on around me, and I still never forgot those words of Jesus from the mountainside that day. It was as if this tiny seed were planted in my mind. Later on, I heard stories about these followers of Jesus who followed him around and learned from him every single day. They called them disciples. There were some stories about them that were not very flattering, but for the most part, they were rather praiseworthy. You could tell that when his disciples failed, morally and otherwise, they always got back on track and continued to do more and more good things. It was something different about them, and it was a good different. So as I grew to become a man, things made more sense, and word spread about these good works of the disciples. Even after he died, that is, the teacher, and there were actually rumors that he actually wasn't dead after all because hundreds of people saw him after that day. That's another story. The disciples continued his work. Just like Jesus, the disciples felt the sting of persecution too. There were stories of them being wrongly beaten and imprisoned no matter where they went. But no matter how much they were beaten and imprisoned, more and more people joined this group of people who became known as people of the way. Well, it defied all logic, but what happens is when you become a member of the way, you automatically become a marked person. And what the people didn't realize is that they knew these individuals were totally committed to this mission, which is what drew people in. As I heard stories of the disciples being persecuted, the words from Jesus came back again as he said, "Blessed are they, or you, when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so they persecuted prophets who were before you." You know, in time, I arrived at a place in my life where I did accept Jesus into my life, and I became what they were calling a Christian. Life has not been easy since I made that decision, but I do look forward to my rewards in heaven that this Jesus promised us. In the meantime, we take comfort from the words of Jesus because his words are packed with great truth that will never fade. And I know that his words are true because once I have been given eternal life by Jesus, I experienced what it was like to mourn, but be comforted, to obtain mercy, be merciful and obtain mercy, and to rejoice at my persecutions. I can still remember that day on the mountainside so long ago, but if that memory would ever leave me, I will always have this joyous feeling that is born of the love of Jesus that cannot be put into words. So my prayer this day is that you will believe that the words of Jesus are true, and my prayer is also that you will have put your faith in Jesus as your Lord, as I did. You don't actually have to have been there on the mountainside that day to feel the importance of his words. They speak to us with great force. And I know his words will never fade away because they are the actual words of the living God in heaven. Let us now join together in prayer and pray to the same Jesus who is alive forevermore. We will close out our service this morning by singing together our hymn of dedication. This is number 213. I know whom I have believed.
I know not why God's wondrous grace to me He has made known, nor why unworthy Christ in love redeemed me for His own. But I know I have believed and am persuaded that He is able to keep that which are committed unto Him against that day. I know not how this saving grace to me gave Him heart, nor how believing in His word brought me within my heart. But I know I am believed and am persuaded that He is able to keep that which are committed unto Him against that day. I know not how the Spirit moves, convincing men of sin, revealing Jesus through the Word, creating faith in Him. But I know I have believed and am persuaded that He is able to keep that which I committed unto Him against that day. I know not what of good or ill may be reserved for me, of weary ways or golden days, victorious faith I see. But I know I am believed and am persuaded that He is able to keep that which are committed unto Him against that day. I know not when my Lord may come at night or noonday fair, or if I walk a little with Him, or meet Him in the air. But I know I am believed and am persuaded that He is able to keep that which I committed unto Him